Today, we're going to unpack a story that starts with a $5 insult and somehow ends with a multi-million-dollar comeback. It's a wild ride about betrayal and, honestly, incredible resilience. And it all kicks off with a moment of pure shock. So these are the first words we hear from a son who's just gotten home from a 6-week European vacation. He's not upset about lost luggage or a bad flight. Nope. He's standing in his mother's living room watching his entire world just completely fall apart. And this is where it all started, with $5, a single crumpled bill left on a coffee table. You have to understand, this wasn't a gift. It was a test. It was an insult. And it was the spark that lit the fuse for everything that came next. And that's the big question, right? How does that happen? Because that $5 didn't lead to despair. It actually unlocked a forgotten skill set, uncovered a massive betrayal, and ended with a reckoning that absolutely no one, especially her son, ever saw coming. Let's get right into it. Okay, so our story starts with Margaret Williams. She's a 68-year-old widow living a pretty quiet life. That is until her son David and his wife Jessica show up at her door one day with a plan. I mean, just look at the contrast here. It's pretty stark. On one side, you have Margaret's reality. She's on a fixed, modest income. On the other side, David's brilliant plan, a luxury trip for him and his wife, paid for by cutting off his own mother's support. And the worst part? He frames it as a lesson in independence. He wasn't just pausing the help. He gave her this condescending lecture on his way out the door. Oh, and the irony here is just staggering. As he leaves her with that one single $5 bill to cover 6 weeks of everything, food, bills, you name it. These are his parting words. He had absolutely no idea how right he was, or how those words would come back to haunt him in a big way. So after the initial shock, and I imagine a whole lot of anger, something inside Margaret just shifted. That insult? It became fuel. She didn't panic. She got strategic. It was time to remember who she was long before she was a widow and a mother. And what's so incredible is how methodical she was about it. This wasn't some desperate scramble. It was a business launch. First, she took a hard look at her dire situation. Then, she inventoried her skills and realized she had 37 years of professional bookkeeping experience just sitting there gathering dust. So she took immediate, practical action. And that first client, her neighbor, yeah, that was just the beginning. The growth was just explosive. Think about it. From $5 in our pocket to over $2,000 in earnings in just 2 weeks. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving. Word of mouth was spreading like wildfire. Margaret Williams was no longer the dependent widow her son left behind. She was suddenly the most in-demand financial consultant in the neighborhood. But just as Margaret was getting her life back on track, there was a knock at the door. And it turns out that $5 insult, that was just the tip of the iceberg. The real betrayal was so much deeper. Yeah, a man in a suit holding a folder. He was there about a loan. A loan that Margaret knew nothing about. He starts explaining that her son David had submitted an application right before he left for Europe, and, well, the first payment was now overdue. $53,000. Let that sink in for a second. Taken out using her house, her only real asset, as collateral. David hadn't just left her with pocket change. He'd mortgaged her entire future to fund his second honeymoon, all completely behind her back. You know, this isn't just a family squabble over money. What David did has a legal name, elder financial abuse, and it's a serious federal crime. The investigation later found out he'd used a power of attorney she'd signed when she was sick with pneumonia to push the whole fraudulent loan through. So, armed with this devastating new knowledge, her booming new business, and a team of lawyers, Margaret didn't just sit around and wait for David to come home. Oh no, she prepared a little welcome home party he would never, ever forget. This right here, this was the moment of reckoning. David waltzes in, probably expecting to find the same dependent mother he left behind, ready to show off his souvenirs from Italy. Instead, he walks straight into his own arrest, orchestrated by a woman who is now a confident, composed business owner, flanked by 2 FBI agents. And that was his desperate plea. Can you believe it? Even with federal agents in the room, he still expected her to save him, to smooth things over just like she always had. He looks right at her, just waiting for her to make it all go away.
And her silence was the most powerful response she could have possibly given. In that one moment, by saying absolutely nothing, she said everything. The cycle of enabling him was officially broken. The consequences were his and his alone to face.
But the story doesn't end with an arrest. You see, what happened next wasn't about revenge. It was about restorative justice, this idea of repairing the harm rather than just punishing someone, and building something brand new from all the wreckage. So, in a pretty remarkable move, Margaret actually proposed a modification to the prosecutor's plea deal. She didn't just want him punished, she wanted him to understand. So she required him to teach financial literacy to other seniors, supervised by her, by the way, forcing him to look the very vulnerability he exploited right in the eye. And you can see how the consequences rippled out from there. Over the next 5 years, David slowly starts to earn back a tiny measure of respect. Jessica, realizing how deep David's deception went, divorces him, but actually finds her own path to redemption by working for Margaret's firm. And finally, that debt is fully repaid. This chart just shows the whole crazy financial arc of the story. From the absolute insult of $5 to the betrayal of $53,000, all the way to the triumph of her firm, which eventually secured a $2.7 million grant to expand its financial literacy programs statewide, with a reformed David as the program director. This quote from Margaret really just gets to the heart of her whole transformation, doesn't it? Her power didn't come from trying to control her son's terrible actions, but from taking total control of her own. She focused on building, not breaking. And I mean, the results speak for themselves. And that's really the thought I want to leave you with. Margaret's story is a powerful reminder that sometimes our deepest betrayals can unwillingly create the exact space we need for our greatest growth. The real question is, what do we choose to build in that space when it's handed to us?